Story 1.
Count Reinhard was heading towards the castle of Duke von Gensau, his friend and comrade, with whom he had fought shoulder to shoulder for 15 years to liberate the Holy Sepulchre. The Duke had fallen during the assault on Jaffa, shielding King Richard the Lionheart from an enemy's spear with his own body. In the castle remained young Leonora, the Duke's daughter and Count Reinhard's fiancée. There had been no news from her for many years, and the rumors that reached him were horrifying. It was said that the ancient castle of Gensau had been taken over by dark forces, and that young Leonora was held captive by them. Fulfilling the promise he had made to her father, the Count rode to the castle to find out everything in person. The barely visible road in the twilight led up into the mountains. The Count had to maneuver around deep ruts and boulders, leap over fallen trees and ford streams, whose burbling waters shimmered in the starlight. Suddenly, his horse neighed anxiously and shook its mane. A piercing woman's scream came from somewhere to the left. The Count's hand involuntarily went to the hilt of his sword. He couldn't make out any words, just the scream, but it was filled with so much agony, despair, and plea for help that the Count pulled on the reins and turned left. The horse snorted and resisted, and he had to whip it several times before it headed towards the darkening ridge of the nearby range. It seemed that there, beyond the rise, a woman was being tormented, fighting back with her last strength and screaming in vain hope, relying only on the mercy of Providence. The Count hurried, spurring his horse, and the closer he got to the top of the hill, the more frenzied and piercing the screams became. Unsheathing his sword, the Count forced his horse into a gallop, but as soon as he reached the crest, the horse neighed loudly and reared up, somehow managing to stop at the very edge of a dizzying chasm, at the bottom of which swirled white mist and flashed crimson lights. The mysterious scream abruptly ceased, and everything plunged into a sinister silence, broken only by the frightened snorting of the horse. For several terrifying moments, the horse maintained its precarious balance on the edge of the abyss. Its front hooves were suspended over the chasm, from which death itself seemed to be staring at the night with blood-filled eyes. The faithful steed finally recoiled, and the Count breathed a sigh of relief. The wind howled sharply, and distant thunder rumbled somewhere in the mountains. The Count returned to the road and continued his journey, looking out for the lights of a roadside tavern. He increasingly encountered mighty oaks that had been struck by lightning many times, and soon the road led through an impenetrably dark forest. Pale lights wandered behind the trunks. Sometimes distant laughter, crying and wailing reached the traveler's ears. His foaming horse neighed restlessly, pricking up its ears. But whenever the Count thought of turning back, a pang struck his heart, and he spurred his horse on. In the village where he had spent the previous night, they had persistently advised him not to take this route, and even more so, not to stop at the tavern at the foot of the mountain. Its owner was said to be involved with dark forces. Many even doubted the tavern's very existence, claiming that it, like the entire sinister region in the foothills, had long been abandoned by people. The Count was already considering dismounting and spending the night in the forest when a steady, unwavering light, a sure sign of human habitation, appeared around a new bend in the road. The horse resisted, sensing something amiss, neighing, and trying to turn back. The Count had to dismount, take it by the bridle, and lead it almost by force. Soon, the silhouette of a steep-roofed building appeared in the starlit darkness. A light burned in the only window of the log building, clinging to the steep slope of the mountain to the right of the road. Hearing the neighing, the tavern keeper stepped out onto the threshold and greeted the traveler with a low bow. In the nocturnal light, his gaunt face seemed bluish-white, and his deep-set eyes resembled black holes. Twisting his lipless mouth into a smile, he assured the knight that a hearty dinner and a comfortable bed awaited him in the tavern, and oats and a stable awaited his horse. The Count, used to not trusting his horse to strangers, led it under the shed himself and gave it oats. The horse trembled, snorted, and twitched its ears, and when the Count headed towards the tavern, it neighed restlessly. Accompanied by the tavern keeper, Reinhard entered a low, dimly lit hall. What surprised him the most was that there were guests here. In these ill-reputed places, there should have been complete desolation, yet there were at least half a dozen patrons in the hall. Against the wall, by the light of a smoking torch, a group of ragged men played dice, losing a whole pile of gold coins to each other. The Count thought that they could only have acquired the gold by robbing someone, and the coins likely still bore the blood of their innocent victims. Closer to the fireplace sat two burly men who looked like wealthy peasants or merchants, listening to a gypsy woman laying out cards before them. Further away, in a dark corner, a tall man in a dark cloak with a hood pulled low over his face drank wine. The Count was struck by the silence in the hall. The ragged men played silently. The dice rolled on the table with a dull thud, and the gypsy woman whispered softly. No one turned to look at the guest. He sat by the window, tossed a gold ducat on the table, and immediately the tavern keeper placed a bottle of wine, a glass, and a plate of roasted meat with a sauce that resembled black blood before him. Overcoming the dread that the gloomy tavern and its inhabitants instilled in him, the Count began a conversation with the tavern keeper about the castle of Gensau. The tavern keeper furrowed his brow worriedly, looked around, and whispered that he hadn't heard anything about the castle for a long time, because the few travelers who headed in that direction never returned. "I advise you, good sir, to turn back while the path to the fork of the 3 roads is still safe," he kept repeating. "Go back while there's still time. Go back. Why have your lands become deserted?" Reinhard continued to ask, ignoring his insistent advice. "What happened here? Did the duchy suffer a devastating invasion that forced the population to leave?" "There was no invasion, my lord. On the contrary, there has been complete peace here for many years." "Then why is the road to the castle in such poor condition, and I didn't meet anyone on the way to the tavern?" "They say that either bandits or demons roam the surrounding forests, killing everyone who invades their domain," the tavern keeper replied, glancing around again as if afraid someone might hear him. "So it's better to flee these parts if you want to stay alive. What have you heard about the mistress of the castle, Duchess Leonora?" the Count asked his main question. The tavern keeper spread his hands. "I haven't heard any news about her for a long time. Rumor has it that she died. The gates of her castle are always locked, and there's no access to it." His sunken eyes glowed ominously red in the torchlight, and at the sight of his bluish face, from which the skin, like that of a leper, was already starting to peel, the Count felt an unspeakable horror. "I don't believe she is dead," he said firmly, trying not to show his anxiety. "Ask the fortune-teller," the tavern keeper suggested. "She can predict fate, cast spells, and communicate with the souls of the dead. She will tell you the whole truth." The Count glanced at the far table and was quite surprised to find that the gypsy woman was no longer there. "I'm here, noble knight, always at your service," a woman's voice said behind him, and he shuddered, seeing the gypsy woman next to him. "If you want, I will tell you all about Duchess Leonora, whom you seek so eagerly." Without waiting for an invitation, she sat down in front of him and spread out the cards with a wave of her hand. "5 years ago, shortly after your departure to Palestine, The young Duchess suffered cruel mental anguish and sorrow in her castle due to the separation from you, the gypsy woman began. It ended with her, in a fit of inconsolable grief, throwing herself from the tower and crashing to her death. Since then, her restless spirit roams these parts, waiting for you to kill your mortal body, seize your immortal soul, and forever carry it off to the halls of the Angel of Darkness. The Count was silent, struck by her words, and looked at the cards, which seemed to rise and fall on the table by themselves. On their magically animated pictures, hangmen swung, wolves bared their teeth, executioners beheaded, coffins opened, and corpses reached out. Hideous jesters laughed and shook their heads in caps with bells. "The cards don't lie," the gypsy woman said, pushing towards the Count a card depicting a wolf, then one depicting a hangman. "You see, everything on the path to Leonora's castle foretells your doom. Leave these places, knight, while the road back is still open." "Leave, leave," echoed the tavern keeper. The horror-stricken Count most wanted to jump up and rush out of this terrible house. But then the Saracen's needle once again pierced his heart, especially sharply, and he groaned, clutching his chest. The wound inflicted on him by the sorcerer in a long, exhausting duel in the Syrian desert had tormented him for the past few months. The sorcerer appeared before him in the guise of a knight, with a black face and 2 protruding tusks. Seeing the Count, he laughed and shouted that he had been wandering alone in this desert for many weeks and wanted to quench his thirst with human blood, then drew a black sword and rushed at the crusader. The Count bravely accepted the challenge, engaging him in a duel. The Saracen was cunning and skilled in battle. Swords clanged, crossing and striking sparks, and in the end, the Count managed to pierce the sinister Saracen's heart. And then a miracle happened that struck the knight with horror. The Saracen, convulsing in death throes, took his true form. Before the Count lay a dying creature covered in golden spines, with the head of a dragon, the claws of an eagle, and the tail of a crocodile. Black smoke billowed from its monstrous mouth, and its clawed fingers scratched the ground, reaching for the Count. Suppressing his fear, the knight rushed at the shapeshifter and delivered the final fatal blow. But the creature, with its last strength, lunged at him and pierced the Count with its spiny hide, one of the spines entering Reinhard's chest, piercing his heart, and remaining there, so that even the famous Arab healer who later examined him did not dare to remove it, saying that if he did, the Count would die immediately. The return from Palestine was marked by relentless, excruciating pain that began to subside only recently, as the Count approached his homeland. But though the pain had lessened, numbness spread from the heart, enveloping nearly the entire left side of his body. His left leg was weak, his left arm was completely useless, and its fingers felt like wood. Count Reinhard felt death approaching, from which there was no escape. A new pang in his heart drove away his doubts. "Damn liars!" he exclaimed, scattering the enchanted cards, which flew into the air and swirled above the table. "Leonora is alive and waiting for me." "Of course, noble knight, of course," the tavern keeper quickly agreed, his crooked grin never leaving his grim face. "You will reach the castle and meet Duchess Leonora, but first you need to strengthen yourself." He filled the glass with wine. "Drink. It will give you strength." The Count took the glass, and a deadly silence fell over the tavern. The ragged men, having left their dice, and the burly men by the fireplace, stared at him expectantly. Only the tall man in the hood remained unmoved. The anxious neighing reached the Count. He shuddered and involuntarily glanced at the window, in the mica panes of which the night blackened, and the dimly lit hall, the fireplace, the long tables, and his own gaunt face framed by a graying beard were reflected. He stared at his reflection for a moment, not understanding what had so struck him, when it suddenly dawned on him that he could not see the reflections of the tavern keeper and the gypsy woman sitting before him. "Sorcerers! Vile sorcerers!" he shouted, leaping from the bench and splashing wine at them. They gasped and recoiled. The poisoned wine left terrible burns on their faces, where the skin began to peel away, revealing decayed flesh and yellowing bones. "Leonora is dead!" the gypsy woman screeched, catching one of the cards in mid-air and showing it to the Count. "The hanged man indicates that she is in the underworld." At that moment, all fear left the knight, leaving only cold, unreasoning rage in his soul. "Liar!" he shouted in a thunderous voice. The two burly men, whom the Count had taken for peasants or merchants, menacingly advanced on him with drawn swords. Their dark faces glowed with grim eyes, their mouths twisted in a bestial snarl. "Spawn of Satan, you want to kill me," he said, unsheathing his sword as well. "But wait. First I will send you to your black master." He charged at the burly men, cleaving one of their skulls in the first minute of the fight. The other was more skilled with a sword and parried his furious attack. Blades clashed, tables and dishes clattered as they were overturned. The ragged men surrounded the fighters, waiting for the outcome of the battle. The Count struck down the second opponent, laughing triumphantly as he had laughed in the midst of a brutal melee, surrounded by enemies. "What vile creatures think the beast is cornered and you have easy prey?" he shouted, waving his bloodied sword threateningly. "I'm lame and only one hand obeys me, but even so I will deal with you. Well, why are you standing still? Here I am, a one-armed cripple, your sure victim." The ragged men drew swords from beneath their rags and rushed at him. The Count easily repelled their attack and charged, delivering deadly blows left and right. As soon as the last ragged man with a pierced throat fell to the floor, the gypsy woman grabbed the Count's arm and whispered, "Leave here. Return to the fork of the 3 roads and take any but the middle one. On those roads, wealth and fortune await you. Where you are heading now, you will die. Dozens of knights as brave and noble as you have tried to penetrate Leonora's castle, and they all met death. Their souls are cursed and roam these parts, lurking for the living. Look, Count, with whom you fought." Reinhard looked at the dead men, and sweat broke out on his forehead. The tattered clothes covering the bodies of the slain instantly rotted and decayed. Flesh similarly withered away swiftly. At the Count's feet lay dried-up skeletons. Suddenly they began to move. One by one they tried to rise. Their yellowed skulls with empty eye sockets turned to the crusader, who was paralyzed with horror. The gypsy woman laughed. "Run, knight! Save yourself. The road back is still free." The skeletons, clattering their bones, began to rise, and before the Count could recover, they picked up swords and surrounded him. The Count had to fight again. Under the blows of his sword, desiccated bones cracked and flew out of their joints, but the monstrous creations, even losing hands and skulls, continued to advance, pressing the knight against the wall where it was most convenient for them to deliver a mortal blow. The Count's strength waned, and finally, one of the skeletons, whose skull was intact, managed to pierce him in the left, least protected side. And at that very moment, the sword that had pierced the Count disappeared, and the skeleton that had struck fell and crumbled into dust. Reinhard stood frozen, stunned. Another skeleton struck his left arm with its sword, but the sword evaporated in the air and the skeleton fell and crumbled. A sudden realization struck the knight. It turned out that the needle, slowly wearing down his body, possessed a miraculous power over which these hellish creations had no control. Revived in spirit, he sheathed his sword, lifted his lifeless left arm with his healthy hand and struck it against the surrounding dead men. At the slightest touch, they fell as if cut down. Within a minute, there was not a single skeleton near the Count. The gypsy woman, having turned into a bat, circled above him with a loud squeak that sounded like, "Run away, run." With flames dancing on his outstretched palms, the tavern keeper approached the Count. The Count retreated to the door. The tavern keeper waved his flaming hands and lunged at him, but Reinhard dodged and brought his sword down on the servant of Satan's head. From the split skull, breathing fire and setting the floor around it ablaze, a snake crawled out. Then a thunderous laugh suddenly echoed, causing the entire house to shake and rubble to fall from above. The knight turned around. By the far wall, his head reaching the ceiling, stood a stranger. The cloak had been thrown off, and his steel armor gleamed menacingly in the torchlight. His eyes on a dark gray, rough face as if hewn by an axe blazed with fire, and a fanged mouth grinned. "Is that you, Satan?" the Count cried, pointing his sword at him. The stranger laughed even louder. "No," he finally roared. "I am but his humble servant, sent here to stop you, knight. Come to your senses and turn back while the path is still free." "I must get to Duchess Leonora's castle," Reinhard shouted. "What have you done to her? Where is she? Even if I perish, I will find out." The giant roared in anger, and a mace that spewed lightning appeared in his hands. The knight was gripped by a tremor of mortal terror, but then the needle once again pierced his heart, this time especially sharply, and he came to his senses. His hand gripped the sword with unprecedented firmness. The monster swung the mace, but the Count recoiled, instinctively presenting his left shoulder to the blow, and the mace shattered. In the next instant, the steel blade, aimed by the Count precisely at the seam of the armor, plunged into the sorcerer's chest up to the hilt. The giant fell with a thunderous roar and disappeared as if he had never been. Meanwhile, the flames engulfing the tavern grew more intense. Outside, anxious neighing could be heard. Count Reinhard jumped onto the windowsill, shouldered the frame, and leapt into the courtyard just as the burning roof collapsed with a crash. In the courtyard, under a shed, his tied-up horse was struggling and neighing in terror. An approaching fire-breathing snake. Its head rose toward the horse's muzzle, scorching it with flames, and the horse strained at its tether, trying to strike the monstrous creature with its hoof. The Count arrived just in time. His sword slashed the snake in half, but the diabolical creature, cut into 2, then 3, then 4 parts, continued to live. Each severed piece turned into a snake that tried to lunge at the Count or entangle the legs of his horse. The Count untied his steed and leapt into the saddle. The horse pranced beneath him, leaping over the burning fence in a single bound and darting onto the road. The Count whipped it, directing it upwards towards the pass. The horse backed away and turned in the opposite direction. Finally, overcoming its fear, the horse heeded the rider's command and first cautiously, almost at a walk, then faster and faster, galloped along the rocky, barely visible road in the darkness. The glow of the fire remained behind, and soon the path was illuminated only by the occasional lightning flashes in the impenetrable darkness. The Count had to rely entirely on the horse's instincts, which galloped so swiftly that the wind howled in the rider's ears. The steed gained miraculous strength. It raced with such speed that not a drop of sweat appeared on its smooth, dry flanks. No foam fell from its lips, and its breathing remained even, as if the furious gallop was merely a light trot for it. The diminishing light of the burning tavern would sometimes disappear behind them, then reappear with each new turn of the road. When the Count glanced back at it for the last time, he noticed that the light was not where it should have been. It circled, even soared above the forest treetops, flapping fiery wings, seemingly trying to pursue him. The Count spurred his horse. The fiery bird fell behind and finally disappeared behind the crest of a low mountain, which the Count rounded before descending into the valley. The wind howled, the trunks of the oaks groaned and leaned, their branches whipped the rider, trying to knock him from the saddle, and the incessant forest creaking was filled with human wails. Suddenly the Count, in great amazement, pulled on the reins, stopping his horse. A lightning bolt of unprecedented size flashed in the clouds and remained glowing, illuminating the mountains and the valley below with a pale, ghostly light. The world, lit by it, transformed so much that the Count's hair stood on end in unspoken horror. He thought he had entered hell. Around him were not mountains but crouching giants, covered with thick forests. Their snow-white faces were upturned, their eyes directed at the sky. At times these monstrous beings, crushed to the ground by their own immeasurable weight, let out heavy sighs that echoed through the surroundings. Underneath the clouds, flocks of transparent dragons with bat-like wings flew silently. The dragons appeared glass-like and shimmered silver in the glow of the magical lightning. Some of them flew close to the ground, touching the giants with their wings, then soared back up, merging into the gathering of their kind. The forest in the valley was no longer a forest, but a turbulent sea of living creatures, hairy, multi-armed, and malevolent, resembling both humans and spiders. They groaned, grunted, growled, howled, and waved thousands of arms, as if threatening the Count, who had to pass through their terrifying throng along the road. The Saracen Needle had to overcome Reinhard's fear with such intense pain that a loud cry escaped his throat, causing the giants to stir, triggering landslides, rumbling and shaking the ground, and turning their gaze towards the traveler. The nearest giant extended its gigantic hand with black, gnarled fingers towards the rider and horse, intending to grab them both. But the Count's horse, rearing up, neighed loudly and charged towards the enchanted forest with such speed that sparks flew from its hooves. It managed to dive into the thick of the monstrous creatures that had once been trees and disappear among them before the giant hand could reach it. In frustration, the giant tore several werewolf trees from the ground, and a groan of dismay echoed through the surroundings. Meanwhile, hairy hands reached for the rider from all sides. The Count, having tied the reins to his left hand, took the sword in his right hand, and without fear began to strike at the limbs of the dreadful creatures, who withdrew them with cries of pain. The Count's steed galloped through the forest, seemingly knowing the destination as well as its rider. It responded to the threatening howls of the living trees with short, angry neighs. Finally, the terrifying creatures parted. The road emerged into the open, and the Duke's castle appeared. The Count barely recognized it. Before him stood one of the most astonishing visions of the phantom world, revealed to him by the enchanted lightning. The castle, familiar to the Count, had wondrously transformed. Its buildings appeared taller and more graceful, the towers more delicate, the spires thinner, and lights shone in all the open windows. But what struck him most were the walls and roofs, which sparkled and shimmered unbearably in the lightning's glow, making it seem as if they were made of precious diamonds, sapphires, and pure mountain crystal. Transparent dragons circled above the pointed towers, barely missing them with their wings. A broad, straight road like a beam led to the castle gates, paved with polished slabs that shone in the lightning as brightly as the entire castle. The Count turned towards it, but the horse neighed loudly and shied away from the slabs. The Count began to whip and spur it. The horse, snorting, dropped to the ground. Frustrated, the knight dismounted and headed towards the road, dragging the resisting horse by the bridle. The steed resisted with all its might. Reinhard, deeply troubled, dropped the reins and moved towards the road, gleaming just a few meters away. Then the horse jumped up, overtook him, and galloping to the slabs, struck them with its hooves. Immediately there was a deafening crash. The earth opened up, and the horse fell into the chasm, on the edge of which the Count barely held on by a miracle. The same chasm swallowed the beautiful castle along with the road. The alarmed giants howled. The werewolf trees behind the Count stretched their hairy arms to the black heavens. And only the transparent dragons continued to frolic under the clouds, indifferent to the anxieties and vicissitudes of all earthly and heavenly worlds. The Count barely managed to retreat from the terrible abyss. The edges of the chasm, like an insatiable mouth, closed, quivered, and stilled. Everything around calmed down. Then, looking around, the knight recognized the familiar valley and the ancestral castle of Gensau, which he had visited many times in the past. The castle appeared as a black, abandoned ruin. The road leading to it was overgrown and barely visible among the stones and shrubs. Mourning the loss of his horse, the Count cautiously stepped onto it and walked towards the gates. As he walked, the gloomy mass with crenellated towers and powerful fortress walls loomed closer. Not a single sound came from the castle. Everything was dead. Only a crimson light flickered in the upper window of the main building. As soon as the Count approached the moat, the drawbridge lowered with a screech, and the portcullis of the tower gates lifted. It was clear that the traveler was expected here. The knight crossed the bridge and passed through the gates without encountering a single living soul, and as he entered the courtyard, a hurried screech sounded behind him. The bridge lifted, and the portcullis fell, blocking his exit. In the silence, a malicious laugh echoed, answered by the cries of an owl from the dark arrow slit of a distant tower. Keeping his hand on the hilt of his sword, the Count approached the open doors of the main building, where he had seen the light in the upper window, passed through the dark foyer, and found himself in a spacious vaulted hall. At first it was dark, with only the dim light of enchanted lightning streaming through the narrow slits under the ceiling, illuminating the vaults. Then suddenly the hall was lit with a red twilight glow. The Count's breath caught in horror. Enormous figures in steel armor and helmets emerged from the corners. The devilish warriors swung giant swords and brought them down on the intruder. But the knight's sword gleamed brightly in the darkness, and when it touched the giants' swords, their metal instantly crumbled into dust. Immediately, the helmets and armor of the giants disintegrated like sand, revealing desiccated skeletons that emitted piercing moans and mindlessly moved their bony fingers. The Count headed for the staircase leading to the upper chambers. As he climbed the steps, he heard screams and cries that filled his heart with fear. Yet he did not hesitate for a moment, and fearlessly entered the second hall, illuminated by the same ominous crimson glow. In the middle of the hall sat pale, hook-nosed old women in rags, surrounding a huge pan where something was frying. As he approached, the Count saw strangely melted naked human bodies, dismembered and mixed together like scrambled eggs. What struck him most was that these people were alive despite the dreadful transformation of their bodies. They writhed and convulsed, and from their distorted mouths came screams filled with such agony that Reinhard's heart contracted with fear and sorrow. Thighs, knees, chests, and bellies fried in the pan. The witches stirred them with forks. One of the old women poked a man's organ with them, and his scream turned into a rasping squeal. Then the witch, holding the member with the forks, began to cut it with a knife. The Count turned away from this repulsive scene, and immediately another, no less disgusting, one presented itself to him. Naked women hung from the walls upside down, and sharp rat faces protruded from their vaginas. The women screamed and twitched in frenzy, experiencing unbearable pain from an endlessly prolonged orgasm induced by the hairy creatures. Not finding Leonora among the hanged, the Count headed for the distant doors. But to reach them, he had to pass through a heap of severed heads, many of which had crushed skulls and gouged out eyes. The heads yelled and screamed, blending their cries with those of the frying men and the hanged women. As the Count made his way through them, they bit at his boots, trying to gnaw through to the living flesh. After passing through the dreadful hall, the knight began to climb the next staircase leading to Leonora's chambers. The steps quaked under his feet and creaked like opening coffins. Suddenly, the Count found that the staircase had indeed turned into a series of coffins. Stepping on them, he felt muffled blows from below, as if the dead were trying to break free from their wooden dwellings. Some succeeded. Lids opened, and blackened bones protruded. The finger joints curled and tried to grab the traveler. As he walked, the Count often lost his balance and nearly fell. Some coffins were so decayed that they broke when he stepped on them. His foot sank ankle-deep into a coffin, and the Count felt the gripping bones around it. He forcefully pulled his foot out of the breach, and bony fingers clung to his boots, torn from the joints of the animated skeletons. Moans, cries, and the crackling of breaking coffins followed the Count incessantly as he climbed the dreadful staircase. His eyes were fixed ahead, on the tall double doors, beyond which a dim and ghostly crimson flame flickered. After passing the staircase, he entered these doors and suddenly found himself in a monstrous maw, lined with enormous teeth. The teeth closed behind him like gates, and in the reddening darkness, a gigantic tongue advanced towards him, which would have crushed and hurled the Count straight onto the teeth, capable of slicing him in half if he hadn't slashed at the tongue with his sword. An ear-splitting wail erupted from the foul throat, and the vision vanished. The Count stood at the beginning of a long gallery. Narrow, elongated windows let in the pale glow of the enchanted lightning, illuminating the dead who filled the gallery, frozen in the positions in which sudden death had caught them. They all decayed in dust and rags of cobwebs that covered everything here, reaching the windows and stretching upward. After the wild screams and cries in the lower halls, the silence in the gallery seemed deathly. Everything here was mute and motionless. The Count moved forward, transitioning from pale light to deep darkness, dragging with him shreds of cobwebs that clung to his boots and brushing against desiccated bodies, which fell with a faint rustle. Suddenly, a flame flared up at the far end of the gallery. The Count hesitated, but a moment later continued on, approaching the fire that erupted from the stone floor and danced in front of tall oak doors, without scorching them. At the doors, the fire guardian forced the knight to stop. Through the flames, a key hanging on the doors was visible. Count Reinhard tried to reach it with his sword, but the enchanted fire instantly melted the Damascus steel, and only the hilt remained in the astonished knight's hand. For a while the Count stood before the flaming guardian, pondering. Finally, with his right hand, he lifted his numb left hand and plunged it into the fire. And then a miracle happened. The hand came alive, but it came alive as if on its own, beyond the will of its owner. Once in the flames, it suddenly stretched out. Its fingers trembled and, reaching for the key, grasped it firmly. The fire guardian immediately vanished, and the hand went numb again, falling limply. The coveted key slipped from its stiffened fingers and fell with a clang at Reinhard's feet. He picked it up and inserted it into the lock. The doors swung open, and the knight entered a spacious round hall with a high ceiling, dimly lit by the light of the enchanted lightning streaming through the windows. The center of the hall was shrouded in thick, milky white fog, from which a green-faced demon in a black cloak embroidered with silvery magical patterns emerged as soon as the Count appeared. "Where is Duchess Leonora?" the knight asked loudly, casting aside fear. "Give her to me, spirit, or get out of my way." The face of the devil's servant remained impassive. "You are unarmed, Count Reinhard," he replied, looking down at the knight. "Your sword was destroyed by the fire guardian, though you passed through his flames. Without a sword, you are powerless against me. But since you have entered this hall, I have no right to kill you before you attempt to revive Duchess Leonora." With that, the demon waved his hand, the fog behind him quickly dissipated, and the Count saw a wide bed on which lay a naked girl, covered with a transparent fabric. "The time allotted to you will be measured by these," the demon said, producing an hourglass, which he placed on a low table near the bed. From the filled upper cup, a stream of sand flowed swiftly into the lower one. "If you do not bring her back to life," the spirit continued, grinning wickedly, "then with the last grain of sand you will die, and your soul will forever wander this castle, while your body will join those skeletons crucified on the wall behind you." Laughing, he dissolved into the air. The Count approached the bed, but as soon as he bent over the sleeping girl, she opened her eyes and sat up, throwing off the cover. "My knight, I have been waiting for you," she whispered passionately, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Kiss me. I long for your embrace." "What? You are alive!" the Count exclaimed in amazement and looked around in confusion. The hall was still empty and gloomy. The enchanted lightning shone through the windows, transparent dragons flew outside, skeletons hung on the walls, and the hourglass on the table relentlessly counted down the remaining time. Looking closely at the girl's face, the Count noticed a strange stillness. This blind gaze is typical of those in delirium or sleepwalking. Overcome with pity, he yielded to her insistent requests and touched her lips with his. Immediately, a fiery passion surged through his veins. The kiss did not return the unfortunate Leonora to consciousness, but clouded and intoxicated the Count's mind. Naked, Leonora clung tighter to him, laughing like a young witch. She covered Reinhard's face and neck with burning kisses, her nimble hands tearing at his clothes, reaching his body and inflaming his desire even more. "Leonora, oh Leonora," the Count whispered, kissing her in return. "What are you doing to me? Do you really want us to unite without the Church's blessing?" The witch possessing Leonora answered yes and burst into hysterical laughter. In a minute, the Count's clothes were removed and thrown to the floor. The seductive female body clung to him. White hands caressed his battle-scarred back and chest. Legs entwined around his thighs, and the red, intoxicating mouth sought his lips. "My knight, show your manly strength," the beauty whispered passionately, "and then I will immediately be freed from the enchantment." And she laughed, embracing and caressing him. Perhaps our union will indeed save her. The thought flashed through his clouded mind. "Indeed, indeed," the witch cried, hearing his thoughts. "Hurry, my love. Raise your banner's shaft high and let it fly like a standard on the battlefield with the pagans." Embracing her firm, trembling body with his healthy hand, the Count was ready to fulfill her wish, especially since everything within him longed for it, when suddenly the small part of his reason still resisting the witch's charms forced him to look away from Leonora's tempting body and glance at the hourglass. The last grains of sand were falling from the upper cup. Two half-naked giants, covered in fur, with fanged mouths and eyes burning like coals, separated from the dark walls of the hall. The demons slowly approached the bed, their hateful eyes fixed on the knight, clutching monstrous axes with bloody blades. The knight shuddered, his passion instantly extinguished. At the edge of his paralyzed consciousness, he managed to think that if he succumbed to the witch's persuasions and deflowered young Leonora without marriage, nothing could ever free her from the grip of dark forces. He, Count Reinhard, succumbing to the charms of the demoness possessing Leonora, was not bringing her closer to salvation, but rather distancing it. With bitterness he had to admit that he could not free Leonora from the satanic spells, which meant his last hour had struck. Almost all the sand was gone from the upper cup. The demons had approached the bed, and the naked witch was writhing with hysterical laughter, rejoicing that she had so cleverly stolen the Count's precious minutes. What could he do in the last moments of his life? Nothing. The only thing still within his power was to end his life before the relentless axes fell on his head. "Damn needle!" the Count cried, feeling for its barely visible tip where his heart beat. "You brought me here to this castle and this hall, promising hope to free Leonora, but instead trapping me where I must die ignobly at the hands of demons, unable to help my poor lady. Cursed Saracen sorcerer! You seek revenge even after death." With these words, the Count groaned in despair and tore the sorcerer's needle from his heart. Blood spurted from the wound. "You are ours, Count," the witch shrieked in triumph, "and after death, ours forever. I will perform a good deed if I kill her," flashed through Reinhard's fading consciousness. His strength was leaving him. Poor Leonora. Better she dies than remains a witch. Groaning with the immense effort of his last strength, he plunged the Saracen needle straight into the heart of the beautiful woman, and at that very moment, an astonishing transformation occurred. She fell back and lay still. Her face seemed to brighten. Near the Count slept a young, innocent creature in an eternal slumber, with a purity that could rival only the clear blue sky. Staring at her with glazing eyes, Count Reinhard was astounded beyond words. "Goddess," his parched lips whispered. "Oh, bright, pure goddess, do you hear me?" But Leonora did not stir. The witch that had possessed her had vanished, and the girl had entered eternal sleep. Count Reinhard had failed to revive the beautiful daughter of Duke von Gensau. "Your time is up, unfortunate one," the giants roared, raising their axes. Their roar merged with the dying knight's cry. "Farewell, Leonora. Know that no one in the world loved you as I did." He dropped his head onto the sleeping girl's face, and his lips, sealing a farewell kiss, pressed against her tender lips just before the bloody weapons of the demons touched his neck. Immediately, the castle shook as if struck, its walls splitting with a terrifying crash, and the knight lost consciousness. Upon waking, he found himself lying on a soft bed under a golden canopy. His bed stood in the middle of a spacious, luxuriously decorated hall, filled with the light of numerous candles pouring from crystal chandeliers. Suddenly, enchanting music began to play, the doors opened, and a girl of otherworldly beauty entered the hall, surrounded by a flock of lovely nymphs. The Count instantly recognized her as the one who had slept in an enchanted slumber on the cursed bed in the terrible castle. Awakened by his kiss, Leonora seemed 100 times more beautiful. In a snow-white dress, she approached the knight and knelt before him, thanking him as her savior. Count Reinhard rose in amazement. There was not a single scratch on his body, which was strong and fit as in his youth. The nymphs helped him don a purple linen tunic adorned with golden embroidery. Then Leonora took his hand and led him to a hall where a celebration was in full swing. She seated him at the head of a long table laden with delicacies and sat beside him. The guests greeted them with joyful shouts, raising filled goblets in their honor, and an endless procession of servants brought more and more dishes. The music played louder, and a choir sang in praise of the betrothed. The guests stood, turning to the young couple, as did Leonora, and the infinitely astonished Count Reinhard had no choice but to rise as well. The young Duchess leaned into his chest and sealed a reciprocal kiss on his lips, filled with the most sincere emotion. Count Reinhard was silent from happiness and amazement, and only by gently squeezing her hand could he express all the love he felt for her. Suddenly, the festive noise died down, and a stifling silence filled the hall. Reinhard looked around and noticed that all the guests, the nymphs, and even Leonora had turned to stone, becoming statues. The music stopped, the candles flickered and began to go out. The walls of the hall trembled, and tree roots began to break through the stone tiles of the floor. Thick fog flooded through the cracks in the walls and floor, and a low growl echoed from it. Reinhard drew his sword and stood ready, waiting to see what threat might emerge from the fog. This time, it was neither a demon nor a ghost, but a huge werewolf. Gray fur covered its powerful body, its eyes glowed red, and its mouth, filled with sharp teeth, emitted a menacing growl. The werewolf charged at the knight with incredible speed. The Count managed to dodge the first blow from the claws, and delivered a counterstrike with his sword, wounding the beast in the side. The werewolf howled in pain and fury, retreated a few steps, then attacked Reinhard again. The hall resounded with the clang of steel and the beast's roar echoing off the walls. Despite the unequal strength, the Count fought the unholy creature, skillfully parrying its blows. But each time he managed to inflict a wound, the injuries on the werewolf's body healed immediately, as if it possessed inhuman regeneration. At one point, Reinhard fell to one knee, exhausted from the prolonged fight, and the werewolf seized the opportunity to pounce on him with the intent to kill. However, the Count, gathering his last strength, threw his sword, which struck the beast's chest up to the hilt. The werewolf froze, let out a prolonged howl, and collapsed to the floor, defeated. Reinhard stood up, wiping sweat from his brow. The fog began to dissipate, and the statues of the guests came back to life, filling the hall with the noise of celebration. Leonora rushed to her knight, embraced him, and whispered, "You have won, my brave knight. Now we are free from all curses." The Count held her tightly, feeling the heaviness lift from his heart. They were together, and no dark forces could ever separate them again.
Story 2.
It happened during summer vacation. Me and my friends decided to take a trip to Europe. There were 5 of us, my buddy Cale, David, Martha, Susie, and me, Bill. We did almost everything together, studied together, and of course, vacationed together. So the idea of traveling together had been brewing for months. The first few days were uneventful. We explored the local sites, admired the architecture of old European cities, and even visited a museum. Martha, with her pale blue eyes that always sparkled with mischief, often took the lead, narrating tales of ancient castles and hidden treasures. Cale, the logical one, would usually chime in with historical facts. Susie, sweet and soft-spoken, would listen intently, her face lighting up at the prospect of every new destination. And David, ever the daredevil, would suggest the most thrilling and often dangerous spots. One day, as we wandered through a small picturesque town, David, with his guidebook in hand, suggested we stop by and stay in an old mansion that was near a forest and an old marsh. The idea seemed tempting. Susie's eyes widened at the thought of staying in a mansion straight out of her beloved Gothic novels. David chuckled, teasing her about hoping to meet a vampire. Cale, however, remained his factual self, commenting on the historical significance of the mansion. At lunchtime, we arrived at the mansion, the appearance of which was really impressive and majestic. Stone gargoyles perched on the roof, their expressions forever frozen in a silent scream. Vines crept up the walls, giving it an eerie yet beautiful touch. The sun's rays, streaming through the tall trees surrounding it, cast long, dark shadows across its facade. The sight took our breath away. The landlord, an older man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, accepted the rental fee from us for a day. He looked each of us over, his gaze lingering a bit longer on Martha and Susie. Then, in a deep, gravelly voice, he pointed us in the direction of a swamp in the forest and sternly warned us not to go there. His intense gaze made the atmosphere tense, and we all nodded in agreement, promising to heed his advice. However, as evening settled and the bottles of wine and beer began to empty, our inhibitions melted away. Cale and David reenacted some of their college pranks, while Martha and Susie giggled, recounting stories from our school days. I sat back, watching my friends, feeling grateful for these moments. Feeling the weight of the alcohol, I stepped onto the balcony, hoping the cool air would clear my head. That's when I heard it, a soft, ethereal melody that seemed to beckon me. The notes floated through the air, weaving a tapestry of sound. "Guys, come here! You have to hear this!" I called out. One by one, they joined me on the balcony. At first, they heard nothing, their expressions questioning my sanity. But slowly, the melody made its presence known to them too. Cale's logical demeanor cracked as his eyes filled with wonder. Martha clasped her hands over her heart, visibly moved. Susie's eyes shimmered with tears while David wore an expression of pure awe. "It's beautiful," Susie whispered. "Who could be playing such music?" Martha pondered aloud. In his typical bold manner, David suggested, "We should find out. Let's see who's behind this enchanting music." I felt a pang of anxiety, recalling the landlord's warning. But looking at my friends, all filled with curiosity and excitement, that fear was replaced by a burning need to know. Armed with flashlights, we ventured into the forest. The music guided our steps, growing louder and more intense the closer we got to the swamp. The trees seemed to sway to its rhythm, their branches dancing like fingers playing an instrument. As we ventured further, the forest closed in around us, its towering trees creating a canopy so dense that even the moonlight struggled to penetrate it. The music became more pronounced, and with every note, it felt like a seductive force was pulling us closer, wrapping us in its hypnotic embrace. When we reached the swamp, the sight that met our eyes was both enchanting and bewildering. Amidst the vast expanse of still water, a small island covered with thick bushes and trees stood out. But what caught my attention was the ethereal figure of a girl. Moonlight glinted off her hair, making it look like a cascade of silver. She appeared as taken aback by our presence as we were by hers. I took a step forward, trying to reassure her. "Hey, we mean no harm. We heard the music and followed it." But as I spoke, she began to retreat, her form slowly melding with the trees. David, who had been silent, turned to me and asked, "Bill," he whispered hoarsely, "who are you talking to?" I pointed towards the island. "The girl. Can't you see her? The one hiding among the trees." David's gaze shifted, and he scanned the thick foliage. But instead of seeing the girl, his focus settled on something else. Something that made his blood run cold. "Oh my God, do you see that?" His voice trembled with fear. "What kind of animal is that? What kind of monster?" David almost fell over in fear. He began to slowly back up. I followed his gaze but saw nothing amiss. Before I could inquire further, laughter broke out. Martha and Susie, looking amused, brushed off David's panic as mere jest. "Really, David? Trying to scare us with ghost tales now?" Susie chuckled. Martha added, "Come on, we're not gullible kids anymore." Kyle, ever the observant one, squinted into the distance. "Hold on. I think I do see some shadows. They look like people." But David's fear had reached its peak. "Run!" he screamed, and without another word he turned and bolted back towards the mansion, leaving the rest of us in a state of confusion. My drunken stupor, combined with David's erratic behavior, left me disoriented. But the music, that mesmerizing tune, called out to me once more. And most of all, I wanted to look at this unfamiliar, beautiful girl again. I wanted to meet her. I turned my attention back to the island, and without giving it much thought, I began to wade into the swamp, each step taking me closer to the beautiful enigma hiding within. The swamp's waters were deceptively deep, and within moments my feet sank into the muck. Panic welled up inside me as I felt the thick mud pull me in. The music's allure faded, replaced by the chilling realization that I was sinking. Desperately, I reached out, trying to find something, anything, to hold on to. "Help!" I cried, hoping that Martha, Susie, or Kyle would come to my aid. But the forest responded with silence. I turned around to look at my friends, but there was no one around. Suddenly, I was alone in the middle of this swamp. My heart raced as the swamp continued to pull me under, the cold, murky water creeping up my legs, my waist, threatening to swallow me whole. The world around me began to blur as desperation and fear threatened to consume me. Every movement felt like a battle, the mire pulling me deeper, rendering me helpless. But as the suffocating darkness crept in, a burst of laughter shattered the silence, snapping me back to the direness of my situation. Through blurry vision, I caught sight of the enigmatic girl perched high upon a tree, her silhouette illuminated by the pale moonlight. Her laughter, tinged with a chilling cruelty, echoed through the dense woods, making every hair on my body stand on end. The vision of her swaying foot and the devilish gleam in her eyes seemed almost surreal amidst my struggle. Desperately, I tried to plead, to beg her for aid. But as my mouth opened, the swamp took its chance, the muddy water gushing in, choking my cries for help. Her face then twisted into a wicked grin, her once beautiful features contorted with malevolence. With a gleeful cackle, she leapt from the tree, diving into the swamp. As her laughter grew louder, I felt unseen hands grip my legs, pulling me further under. Panic consumed me. The world around dimmed as I felt the weight of the swamp pressing in on all sides. But just as the inky blackness threatened to engulf me completely, a sturdy hand thrust itself into my field of vision. A gruff voice, thick with urgency, pierced the muffled silence. "Grab on, don't waste time, grab my hand." Without a second thought, I clutched the proffered lifeline. With a strength that belied his appearance, the stranger pulled me out of the swamp's clutches, depositing me onto solid ground. Gasping for breath, I coughed out the remnants of the swamp's murky waters, the cold night air burning my lungs. As I regained my composure, I took a moment to study my savior. The man towered over me, his frame broad and muscular. Despite the obvious signs of age, the graying hair and beard and the weathered lines etched deep into his face, there was an undeniable vitality to him. Cloaked in a tattered shroud and with an old hat casting a shadow over his piercing eyes, he exuded an aura of mystery. "Have you children not been warned that the swamp is a dangerous place to play?" he said sternly and coldly. Struggling to find my voice, I croaked out my gratitude. "Thank you. I thought I was done for." His sharp gaze met mine. The swamp is no playground, especially after dark. My thoughts drifted back to the hypnotic music, the beautiful girl and her sinister transformation. We heard music," I began hesitantly. "It lured us here." The man's eyes darkened at my confession, his expression inscrutable. "Come," he commanded. "I'll lead you back to your shelter." As we trudged through the dense forest, I couldn't help but marvel at the man's agility. His every movement was fluid, each step seamlessly blending into the next. It was as if he was one with the forest, a part of its very essence. His silent, ghost-like strides left no trace, no sound. It was almost supernatural. A myriad of questions raced through my mind. Who was this mysterious figure? And most importantly, what was the story behind the girl amidst the swamp? But a primal instinct warned me to tread carefully, to keep my queries to myself. Soon enough, the imposing structure of the mansion loomed ahead, its dark silhouette a welcome sight. Stopping at the edge of the forest, the man gestured towards the house, his job done. Before I could express my gratitude once more, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving as mysteriously as he'd appeared. Shaken by the night's events, I made my way back, eager to reunite with my friends, yet haunted by the chilling memories of the swamp and its enigmatic inhabitants. The mansion's once welcoming glow now seemed cold and foreboding as I pushed the door open. The familiar wooden creak seemed to resonate with my own sense of dread. The opulence and grandeur of the foyer, previously a testament to its storied history, now felt cold and distant. David, disheveled and bloody, was crouched near the fireplace. The warm glow illuminated his pale, horrified face. His clothes were soiled, a mixture of dirt and fresh blood that was impossible to differentiate in the dim light. He looked like he had been through hell. "Dav," I began, but he cut me off, his voice quivering. "It had a human face, Bill," he whispered, eyes wide with terror. "A deer with a man's head, thick hair, a wild beard, and it was laughing asterisk, Bill. It laughed as it chased me like some cruel joke only it was privy to." I could only stare in shock as he went on to recount the harrowing encounter. The grotesque vision of a creature that defied logic. David described a frantic struggle, clutching a fallen branch and defending himself against the laughing monstrosity. I think I killed it," he murmured, his voice filled with disbelief and horror. Before I could respond, the mansion creaked, punctuated by a soft, dragging noise from outside. David's eyes widened. He scrambled to grab the closest object, a sturdy-looking chair. "Someone's outside," he hissed, the chair held defensively before him. Steeling myself, I approached the door, intent on peeking out to identify the noise. But before I could, a figure slammed against the door's frosted glass. I jumped back, heart in my throat, as Martha stumbled in. Her appearance rivaled David's in its terror. Dirt smeared her face and clothes, and her eyes. They held a wild, terrified look that sent shivers down my spine. Martha's voice trembled as she recounted the nightmarish scene by the swamp. Her description painted a macabre tapestry. Contorted, mutilated bodies struggling in the mire, their moans echoing through the silent night like a twisted symphony. "It was hell, Bill," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I saw them. People with hollow eyes, torn tongues, decapitated heads, all drowning, reaching out for help. But the hands that tried to save them, they were just as grotesque." Her recollection was interrupted by a loud sob. "2 of them, Bill. They climbed out of the swamp, their muddied and decayed forms crawling towards me. The room felt colder, the weight of her words pressing down on us. But her account didn't end there. "There was a scream, deep within the woods," she whispered, fresh tears spilling. "I think it was Susie. I couldn't think straight, Bill. I just ran. Everything was a blur. I got lost, but it's a miracle I was able to get back here." Silence enveloped the room, punctuated only by the soft crackling of the fire and the distant sound of the wind outside. The reality of the situation began to sink in. The night had taken a dark, unimaginable turn, and two of our own was still unaccounted for. "We need to find Susie and Cale," I broke the silence. "We can't leave them there." David, still visibly shaken from his encounter, shifted uncomfortably. "Bill, after what happened, I'm not sure it's a good idea." Martha, sitting on a plush armchair, her eyes glazed from fear, chimed in weakly. Maybe they'll find their way back. Maybe we should just wait." The wind howled outside as if in response. "We can't risk it. Too much time has already passed," I insisted. "We'll take flashlights and we won't split up." Reluctantly, David nodded, grabbing a flashlight from the table. Martha's hands trembled as she held on to mine for a brief moment. "Be careful," she whispered. I could see the terror in her eyes, but she was trying to put on a brave face. Leaving the mansion behind, David and I were immediately enveloped by the darkness of the woods. The dense canopy obscured the stars, leaving us in an almost tangible darkness. The trees, once serene and majestic during the day, now appeared foreboding, their branches clawing at the empty air. The atmosphere had shifted since we first arrived at this place. The once inviting allure of the woods had turned sinister. David's face was illuminated intermittently by the flashlight, his features contorted with anxiety. Susie! Cale!" we shouted intermittently, our voices echoing off unseen trees and rocks. Every rustle, every distant hoot of an owl seemed magnified, making us jump at even the most harmless of sounds. But it was a distant, soft shuffle that caught our attention. Shadows, deeper than the surrounding darkness, flitted between the trees. "It's her!" David whispered excitedly, pointing toward a shadow that had a vaguely human form. "Susie!" I squinted, trying to get a better view. Something felt off. The shadow was too still, too quiet. "David, wait!" But he was already moving forward, calling out Susie's name, hope evident in his voice. As he approached, the shadow retreated, moving deeper into the woods, leading him on. Without thinking, I chased after him, my own calls a mix of Susie's name and warnings to David. The forest around us seemed to come alive. Branches reached out, tangling in our clothes, pulling at our hair. Each step felt harder, the earth itself resisting our advance, making every footfall a struggle. "David?" I cried out, trying to catch up to him. But before I could, the very ground beneath us gave way, and a familiar sinking sensation gripped me. The swamp was back, or rather, we had unwittingly ventured into it. Cold, murky water rushed up, pulling us down, its thick mud ensnaring our feet. Panic set in. This couldn't be happening again. The treacherous swamp was reclaiming us, its dark waters obscuring vision. I could hear David's muffled screams nearby, his flashlight's beam dancing erratically beneath the water. Suddenly, a distant, eerie tune wafted through the night, the same one that had lured us into the forest initially. But now its melody seemed different, darker, more malevolent. And then, amongst the choking mud and the strangling weeds, a hand grasped mine, yanking me towards the surface. It was David. He managed to somehow get out of the swamp and started dragging me. gasping for breath. I felt the cold, damp soil underneath my palms. Every cell in my body ached. But there by my side was David. His face flushed and his eyes widened with a mix of relief and terror. "David," I panted, my throat sore. "How did you—" He just looked at me, his eyes glazed over. There was a strength in David I hadn't acknowledged before, but his current state was worrisome. His fingers were clenched around clumps of wet soil, and he looked more haunted than I had ever seen him. "We were led here," he whispered almost to himself. "This damn place. It doesn't want us to leave." Pulling myself to my feet, I tried to steady my breathing. The swamp loomed menacingly close, its inky waters hiding untold horrors. Every instinct screamed at me to get away. "We need to move, David." "Now," I urged, but he wasn't responding as he should. Instead, he clutched his head with both hands, his face contorted in agony. "Susie," he murmured. "The piece of wood. The deer head." Over and over, the same haunting words tumbled out of his mouth. It was as if he was trapped in a loop, the traumatic events of the night replaying in his mind. "David, snap out of it," I cried, shaking him. But his eyes were distant, lost. Just as I was contemplating our next move, an unsettling rustle echoed through the trees. The forest, though pitch black, seemed to grow even darker. A feeling of dread washed over me as a large, indistinguishable shadow began to take form. It moved with an eerie grace, drawing closer with each second. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my temple. Running seemed like the best option, but David was immobilized in his trance. Leaving him behind wasn't even a consideration. My mind raced, searching for solutions, but panic clouded my judgment. "David," I whispered urgently, trying to rouse him. But he continued murmuring the same chilling words. "Susie, the piece of wood, the deer head." The shadow was getting closer. It was getting closer and closer. Not knowing what to do next, I instinctively stood up and started to run away. The night's suffocating darkness felt like a tangible presence, pushing against me, urging me to run. Cale's form advancing towards me, backlit by the sparse moonlight, was both a looming shadow and my salvation. The relief I felt as I recognized him was like a torrent rushing through me. "Bill." Cale's voice pierced the stillness. "Why were you running like that?" I stuttered, struggling to reconcile the overwhelming fear I'd just felt with the reality in front of me. "Easy," Cale murmured, reaching out a hand to steady me. "You look like you've seen a ghost." His familiar presence was grounding, but there was no time to waste. I quickly updated Cale on David's condition and our frantic search for Susie. Cale's brows furrowed, glancing toward David, who seemed lost in a daze. "Let's get back to the mansion. We need to regroup." I nodded, recalling the mansion's relative safety. "I believe I know the way." As we each took one of David's arms to support him, we began to slowly make our way through the trees. David kept muttering, seeming completely lost in his madness. Suddenly, in the distance, a melody came through the trees again. It was a pleasant, almost haunting lullaby, an eerie contrast to the horrors of the night. David froze. His pupils dilated, and he seemed to be attuned to a frequency we couldn't hear. Then, with a strength I didn't know he had, he wrenched free and sprinted in the direction of the music. "No, David!" I shouted, already chasing after him. Cale was right beside me, his breathing in sync with mine. The music grew louder, ensnaring us with its melancholic charm. When we finally caught up with David, it wasn't the music that made my heart stop. It was the grotesque tableau before us. A large oak, its branches outstretched like silent witnesses, stood bathed in moonlight, and at its roots, a sight so horrifying that I felt bile rise up my throat. Susie's lifeless body, twisted and mangled, surrounded by a halo of blood. She was dead. She had been brutally murdered. The pungent smell of iron mixed with the earthy scent of the forest floor where I kneeled. My mind swam as the contents of my stomach rejected the horror my eyes had witnessed. Beside me, Cale echoed my revulsion, doubled over in his own fit of retching. David alone remained unnaturally stoic, eyes transfixed on Susie's mutilated form, as if deciphering some message written in her wounds. Then, like a switch, his posture changed, a manic energy surging within him. He wheeled around to face us, his eyes burning with an incendiary mix of fear and determination. "A swamp creature," he stated, voice firm with conviction. "It's the deer with a human face. The same one I thought I killed. It's back, and it wants us." Cale, wiping his mouth, tried to interject. "David, wait. We need to—" But his words were cut short as David let out a primal roar, his grief manifesting as unbridled rage. With a strength neither Cale nor I knew David possessed, he lifted a hefty boulder and charged into the forest, leaving behind a trail of crushed foliage and echoing cries. "David, stop!" Cale shouted, trying in vain to chase after our friend. I attempted to rise, my legs trembling like newborn fawns. Cale, seeing my struggle, returned to my side, helping me regain my footing. "We need to get out of here," Cale murmured, urgency evident in his tone. "The best thing is for us to go back and call the police." The situation was more confusing and scary than we could have imagined. We began our precarious trek to the mansion, but the eerie shadows of the trees kept us on our toes. I was extremely tired and emotionally drained. Trying to make sense of the surreal horrors of the night, I began to tell Cale about my close encounters with the swamp. "That damn swamp, twice I almost drowned in it," I said with anger and frustration. "The first time some stranger saved me, a tall man with a thick beard, and the second time David." Cale halted, staring at me, disbelief painted across his face. "Bill, that stranger was me. I'm the one who first time pulled you out of the swamp. How could you forget?" Confusion settled over me. "What?" "You suddenly waded into a swamp and started drowning. If I hadn't come to your rescue, you would have drowned." Cale pressed, concern etching deeper lines into his already weary face. "Martha saw the whole thing. She got terrified and ran. I chased her down, but when I returned, you were gone." My heart raced, memories fragmenting like shattered glass. If Cale had been my savior, then who or what had I encountered? Fear gripped me as the chilling realization came. The deer with the human head, the murky swamp, David's strange behavior, the fragmented memories. All of these were pieces of a puzzle I was only now beginning to put together. There was only one terrifying question swirling around in my head. Who did David really kill?